we could do the same thing for the date. The problem is that this gets to be a bit repetitive, right? In the sense that you've got a lot of repeated code. So on date change would look very similar to this. It would also have a new date, call set person. It would go ahead and use the spread syntax and so on. But we'd have an on name change. So let's say we have 10 items here, you know, a name and a date and 8 other pieces of information about a person. Then we'd have 10 separate functions we need, an on name change and on date change and on, you know, whatever the other fields are. So let's look at a more general approach that we could use. So the more general approach that we could use is to say, instead of passing in a specific name changed, let's just pass in a more general value that's going to have some slightly different parameters. Okay. So let's just get rid of this. So let's create a new one. Okay, so we are going to, we're in our app, we're creating our name, pass in our value, which is person.name, and then let's go ahead and instead of on name change, since it's calling it value, let's just say on value changed, okay, on value change, so that we have some parallelism. So if we were to pass the props as name, then I think on name change makes sense. But if we're passing the props as value, then we'll use on value change. And what do we want to do here? Well, let's change the contract for the on value change. Okay, let's say we're going to pass another parameter called field, and field is going to be name, and basically we're saying this name and this name are the same. Okay, so they have to match. And on value change, let's just go ahead and assume that it's going to get 2 pieces of information. Okay, so this is just a requirement that name has that we're gonna set on name. So name needs to pass in the field as the first parameter and then the value as the second parameter. And what we can do here is just pass in, let's say, set field, which we're going to write in just a moment. So set field is going to be a function within, of course, the app component. And we're going to say it gets 2 values, a field and a value. Okay. And what are we going to do? Well, we still need to call set person. We know that. Right, this is the function created by useState. And we know we've got a person, and it's just like the old person, except this particular field has this particular new value. So we're going to again use spread syntax. So we're going to say we want to have all the fields from the old person, but then we want for this particular field to have the value. Now this isn't quite right. And the reason for this is now we've created a field whose name is FIELD, and we don't want that, right? This field might be name, this field might be date. So we want actually the value of field. And so the syntax we use in JavaScript is like this. So we use the brackets, and that says, okay, create a field whose name is the value of field and whose value is value. So this will create a, in the case we're calling the name component, this would call set person, ... person, and name is colon value. So it'll change the name. But we can pass the same set field function also to the date component or any other component we want, as long as that component knows that on value change, it should pass back the field and also pass in the new value. So let's look at how we do that in the person. So in the, in the name. So let's just replace it now. So now there's no props on name changed. Instead, what do we have? We have props dot on value change and props dot field. Now, what do we know? We know we still get a parameter, which is E, right? Because this is defined by the DOM. And what are we going to do? We're going to call props dot on value change. And what do we want to pass in? Well, as the first parameter, we need the field. How do we get the field? That's in props.field. The second parameter is e.target value. So this is a way that we can systematize passing back values from children, right? Put a little bit of responsibility on the child, not to just give us back a raw value, but to go ahead and give us back the field that that value belongs to. If we were to go ahead and have lists again, right? If we can imagine that we had a list that was editable, right? So you can change this. Then there's really two levels up that we need to go, right? We need to, from the row point of view, we need to be notified that some change is made and notify our parent, which is the list, okay? And the information we'd pass back probably would include something like an ID number, so we'd know which of these rows had changed. And then we need to pass back information up to the application, right, up to whoever our parent is of this list component, because now something in the list has changed, right? Or we want to change something in the list, perhaps is a better way to specify that. And so the list then would need to tell its parent that one of the list, we wanted to change one of the list elements. And then the parent would go ahead and change some state information there, which is the entire set of arrays, and then could pass that back. So in this particular case, we don't have ID numbers, but very often when you pass an array of things, we wouldn't just pass an array of raw values. We would pass in an array of objects containing IDs. So in this particular case, where we're going to change very small, where we don't have ID numbers, let's just kind of look at what we would do. We would, so let's say we type, write something, we put in, an X. Okay. We, from the list's point of view, would now say, okay, Well, it's not the second element, right, of the list. It's the second element of the filtered list. But from the point of view of the parent doesn't know anything about filtered lists, right? So from its point of view, this is the third element of the list, right, at index number 2. And so we might pass back a callback to our parent of our list, a message containing index number such and such has changed value, right? So we might have back a on value change, and this is a function that takes an index and a new value. Okay, so it would be up to the list to call this on value change, say with the value 2, saying that it's index number 2 in this array, and its new value is now very small x. It would be up to this parent then of the list component to re-render this list with now a new value, where this is now very small x. So there's definitely going to be some design that needs to be done on how to get information back from a child to a parent. The important thing really to keep in mind is you get to design how that works. But the only building blocks you have are props. So your props can include read-only information for display or further computation. And they can also include functions to call back up to the parent. Given those building blocks, you have a large variety of how to do things. Let me just show you one more way we could have dealt with the name. Okay, so yet another approach would have been, so let's say we've got the set field created, and we go back to the old approach where, well, let's just write it in a different way. So an alternate would be, we're going to still define set field, okay? But then we're going to say name, value, colon, person.name. And then we'll pass in all value change. And then our on value change, we're going to go ahead and make this a arrow function. And it's just going to get one value. So we're going to go back again to just passing the name. And then what we could do is just call, let's say, set field of name, new name. So what we're doing is capturing the fact that we want to use a field name. We're capturing that here. Okay. Whereas before, we were capturing it up by putting it in a prop. The good news about this is it's slightly easier for the child because now the name component doesn't need to actually know anything about fields. All it needs to know is it has a value, and if the value changes, call a on value change with the new value. One thing to note is this e.target.value is true for some forms of input, but not others. So if we look, for example, at a checkbox, right? So if it's a checkbox, the value of the checkbox is actually in something called checked. Okay? So you need slightly different syntax if you're using a text box, a checkbox, as opposed to any other input type. You know,